All right, hello. This is Miss Flores, and today we're going to be going off of this first series of civil rights. We're mainly going to be making the main points of civil rights right here today. We're going to talk about the nonviolence, protests, and civil disobedience going on. First, we're really going to look at kind of where the roots of the civil rights movement takes place. All right. And so the first part of the civil rights movement that takes place is going to be really talking about the seed of abolitionists, right? And the seed of abolitionists is basically this movement of where it was anti-slavery, right? Anti-slavery. And so the abolition movement takes place in the 30s, and it was a social and political push for the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people, and to end kind of the racial discrimination and segregation that occurs from that. There are pushbacks that occurred where we had pre-World War II, we had Plessy versus Ferguson, right, where you had that separate but equal Supreme Court cases put in place, and they also have Jim Crow laws, right? And Jim Crow laws, what they do is they segregate. They separate schools, hospitals, trains, water, fountains, by color, by race, right? And so that's what happens here. You also have where the huge discrimination in jobs and housing, and you also have even with the New Deal where it closes in on farms and pushes sharecroppers further north as they lose their jobs. Then in between this during World War II, not right. We have also what we call the Great Migration. We mentioned this before. The Great Migration is this huge, push of traveling of primarily African Americans who are going out north and to the west before and during World War II, looking for new jobs. So a lot of them moved during this time period that we see here. Even though they're moving for more jobs and better opportunities, they're still met with racial discrimination and violence. However, most blacks could vote in the North at this point in time, so it's not great, but it's slightly a bit better. And then during World War II and after World War II, we have more than 1 million African Americans who served in World War II, and they hoped by doing this, it would actually give them the confidence when they come at home, pushing for it to reach the double V, double victory abroad and at home, and they're bringing Jim Crow laws. And this does lead to one aspect of desegregation, which is going to be in the military, and it was via an executive order of Harry Truman in 1948. And this is really kind of where you start to see that really slow push momentum that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, where the fight of equal rights begins to take off during this time period, right? So how was civil rights fought? It's fought through multiple ways. We have the non-violent protests, which are boycotts, hunger strikes, petitions, marches, and strikes, right? Boycotts are refusing to buy goods from certain places, hunger strikes refusing to eat anything, petitions, writing a letter to ask the government or company to change a policy, and then getting as many people to sign and be on board of that, marches and demonstrations. This is probably where a lot of us more see it today, or even going back to Black Lives Matters movement, we see this as well. And it's basically gathering as many people in one place possible, to march in one place to get attention for your cause. You also have strikes that occur, or this is more in a workplace, in order to force your managers or government to change their policies. We also have it through legal action. So lawyers can go in and change laws or policy in a court if they're able to convince the judge the law or policy is unconstitutional. And then that judge will then order them to change that law, right? People can also speak to governmental hearings. They can try to convince legislators to make new laws or repeal the unfair ones. And then lastly, we also have what is called civil disobedience, right? And it's the breaking of law or causing a disturbance in order to get attention for your cause. This is what we see in things like sit-ins, right? So if you go to colleges, you see lots of protests, students protesting, right? And they sit in at an office, right? This is something that we'll see, right? Where protests come into a place, they sit down, and then they refuse to move, right? That's one thing. From all this, we also have organizations that come out from all this during the Civil Rights Movement. So we have what's called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This was established in 1909. We still actually have it today. And who they are is basically what they did is they challenged segregation by filing lawsuits all across the South and even across the United States. The most famous ones that we really think of are going to be Brown versus Board of Education, and James Meredith and the University of Mississippi. Those are the ones we really know them. We also have CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, established in 1947. And this is where we see the Freedom Riders come in, right? Freedom Riders were established in the spring of 1906. This is where their group was from. We also have the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was established by MLK, right? And what they did was try to spread non-violent civil disobedience protests, similar to the Montgomery boycott throughout the entire South. So you see a lot of boycotts as soon as it began to occur, right? Now, so you also have the SNCC, where you have the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. They worked in partner with the Congress of Racial Equality, with the Freedom Riders, right, that occurred in that spring of 1960. We're going to look at some of the more famous icons, and, well, not icons. He is a civil rights icon. We have Thurgood Marshall, but the reason why we're looking at him is because he is an American lawyer and a civil rights activist, right? His main foundational belief was that all people were created equal, and he fought for new protections for women, children, prisoners, and the homeless, right? It is him, when he was a lawyer, he later on became a Supreme Court justice, but as a lawyer, he represented Rosa Parks and Linda Brown in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Later, he was appointed as a justice in the United States Supreme Court in 1967, becoming the first African-American Supreme Court. So we're going to look at some cases, right? We're going to look at some civil rights cases. One of them we have that takes place actually here in Texas. It's Sweat versus Painter, 1950, right? And this is what becomes a stepping stone to Brown versus Board of Education, right? So what the issue here is that you have this young gentleman right here. You have Herman Sweat, right? He is an African American who wanted to attend the law school at UT Austin, right? However, to keep him out of the law school, the university created a separate law school for blacks, right? So it's going back, relying on that. These are organizations separate but equal, right? But Sweat's like, this isn't equal, right? So he takes this all the way up to the Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court declared that Sweat's, the separate school that UTI created, was not in fact separate but equal, as it isolated the students, right? And what this is an enforced Sweat to allow to attend with white students. And this becomes a huge win for the NAACP, because this becomes a change in what was previously stated, right? Okay, we begin to now challenges. This is a new point. Education is the point of changing things of Plessy versus Ferguson. And so later on, you have Brown versus Board, right? The education was the route to poverty, out of poverty for like many black children, right? So the case is what we have here. We have Oliver Brown's 8-year-old daughter who was not allowed to go to a white-only school a couple blocks away, but was instead forced to be bused to a black-only school that was over a mile away. The evidence was then brought forth to the Supreme Court that showed the schools set aside for black students were separate, but they were not equal, right? This is where we have like many studies that come about, psychological studies, that also show that segregation in itself caused black children to believe themselves as non-equal and socially inferior, right? This caused the Supreme Court to unanimously vote that separate schools for African Americans were inherently unequal and therefore violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Right? This sets the precedent for other things to go forward. We also have Hernandez versus Texas, right? Where you have Pete Hernandez, who was on trial for murder by an all-white jury and was given the verdict of guilty. This was the cause for a challenge to an all-white jury, with any people of Mexican descent in the jury, because they're like, hey, like, because in this case, you have the right to a jury by your own peers. And you have Hernandez who says, like, hey, all these people are white. I don't see any Mexican in that jury. How is that fair to me? Because before, Mexicans were considered white. So this goes to the Supreme Court case where they unanimously part that, yes, Mexican Americans are a part and included in the 14th Amendment. And they're prevented from being discriminated against. So then Hernandez gets another trial, this time with some Mexicans in it, but he is still found guilty of murder, right? So that's what we have here. Next icon that we're really looking at is Rosa Parks, and kind of what makes her famous is that Montgomery boycott. Now, one thing today, she is not the first person who does this, but she is becoming the iconic figure that the movement put forward for her, right? So post-World War II, many Southern blacks were no longer willing to wait for the rights, so you start to see this putting in, right? It's after 1945, people were like, we gotta have our rights. So, one of the iconic figures that we have is Rosa Parks, where she sat in a colored section on the crowded bus, and she was sitting in her area, and when she was asked by white men to leave, Rosa Parks refused to leave her seat. This led to her arrest, and this arrest sparked a huge outcry for protests, right? But the Montgomery boycott became one of the first ones, right? The boycott lasted for over a whole year. However, it did lead in a victory as the Supreme Court ruled that Alabama must desegregate their buses. And this is where MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., began to become a well-known figure in the civil rights movement, and it led to the establishment of the SCLC. Now, who was MLK? Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? He was a Baptist that was one of the principal leaders of the Montgomery bus boycott. He is later on becomes arrested in Birmingham, and this is where we get his famous letter from a Birmingham jail that calls for peaceful disobedience and non-violent protests, right? For his own efforts, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 for his humanitarian and civil rights efforts. However, he was assassinated in 1968 by a person called James Earl Ray on his balcony in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Right? So these are images that happened in Birmingham, right? President Kennedy was trying to walk a line of supporting the civil rights movement, but also trying not to push away the Southern Congressmen that he relied on for their support. So, using the television, using the media, African Americans began to target Birmingham, Alabama, which was at the time the most segregated city in the South, right? Here, MLK was arrested amongst all the marches and sit-ins that were Birmingham. This is where we get the letter from Birmingham jail. He calls for protests. He calls his protests unwise, defended civil disobedience, and the in violation of these unjust laws, right? He's like, it is okay to go against these laws when they're unjust, right? So TV cameras, photographers sent images of violence that occurred all around the world, and this sent a message to like other countries seeing this like, oh, this is happening in America. Should this really be happening? And this kind of began to compel Kenny to actually do something about it. The next major protest that we see is going to be the March on Washington that occurs in 1963. And this is really meant to put a huge amount of pressure on Congress to pass the new Civil Rights Bill. You have over 200,000 people marched in Washington. MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech, and it becomes one of the largest political demonstrations that we see. And this becomes kind of a model of peaceful protest, right? JFK killed. So before before JFK could actually pass any laws, he was assassinated, and therefore that led to LBJ stepping in afterwards, right? So in November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, leaving Vice President L.B. Johnson to be appointed as president. LBJ had a little bit of his own agenda. Like, he wanted to be known as bringing the second New Deal almost, right? So LBJ's Great Society was his main target, right? He was from Texas, and he was an initial cause for concern for the civil rights leaders because he was from Texas. He was a Southern person. However, LBJ was far from segregationist. His main goal as president was to introduce a new wave of policies and legislation under what he wanted to call the Great Society. The goal of this was to eliminate poverty and racial injustice, and to help the poor help themselves. That was his whole kind of spiel and thing that he wanted to do. So in doing so, it led him to passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was passed by LBJ. It banned segregation and public accommodations. What this essentially did is it gave the federal government the ability to desegregate schools, prosecute individuals who violated civil rights, and outlaw discrimination in the employment area, right? This established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions, the EEOC, right? So this is one of the acts, however, it's not the only ones it's passed. One of the other major ones that you guys need to know is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What it is, it prohibited discrimination at the voting polls. It established bilingual ballots in areas with large amount of non-English speaking minorities, and it outlawed literacy tests for voters. It gave the federal government the power to oversee all elections as it occurred. And that is the end for this video. If you guys have any questions, please let me know or email your teacher. Thank you.